Welcome to the Consumer Code Show, where we believe that humans are incredible and we are living in the first era in history where behavioral data and AI have hit scale so we can go from consumer insight to business activation in no time. In this show, we explore the world of retail through the lens of demography, cartography, ethnography, and the economy. So without further ado, let's get into this episode. All right, everyone, I am pumped because today's guest is Karlyn Mattson. She is a merchandising expert who's led strategy at some of retail's biggest names: Target, Macy's, Rue 21, GNC, Zappos, Famous Footwear. Am I missing any, Karlyn?
No, well, hopefully that's good. That's plenty.
So she has been on every side of the floor, from fashion to supplements. And if you're trying to get the right product to the right store to the right customer, Karlyn is the person that you want on your corner. Karlyn, I am so excited to talk with you because when I think about retail expansion, I usually think in three buckets. You expand your number of stores, you sell more to new people, but the last one is you sell more stuff to the current people you have. And I think merchandising and localization is just right down the money and probably the biggest lever in within that bucket. So let's talk about this. You've worked across so many different retail models, fashion, wellness, department stores.
Mhm.
Is there any common merchandising challenges that retailers face regardless of category?
Well, I think honestly, and thank you again so much for having me. This is such a passion area for me. But to really, answer that, and you were just heading in that direction, I think winning the hearts and minds of customers, that emotional connection that you have with the customer, and obviously then being able to get more of their mind share, wallet share, becomes really, really important. And by nature, then you have to really have the right levers in place to refine the assortment to really connect with that customer at the right store level. I think that is certainly one. Another challenge that I think retailers face today is kind of went through not having a lot of data. Now there's a tremendous amount of data. And now, how do you harness all of that data? Do you have the systems and opportunities to really take that data and action on it? So I think a lot of retailers are really facing this wealth of data. What do I do with it? And
Hmm.
that's certainly a challenge and opportunity. And, those are, I think, two of the biggest things that have been common threads, and certainly in the last few retailers that I've been at.
The first one is just age old, which is when you walk into your store, do you feel understood? And
Right.
then the next one is like a relatively new problem within the past maybe 20 years, and I think we're going to get into the detail here in a little bit on how
Yeah.
you think about solving that. So let's back up for a second here. What drew you into merchandising in the first place?
Well, I'm inherently a curious person, and I think you have to be, certainly curious to care deeply about the customer, looking at the data and understanding why did something sell and why did it or did it not sell. And so you step back to that, and then it's the decisions about the product. What does the customer need or want? What do they not know they need or want? And so you're really trying to ensure that you're building on that surprise and delight for them. And so I'm an equally left and right brain human, which was fascinating to learn about myself. But I think to be a really strong retailer, you have to have a balance of having the analytic mindset and then having that creative mindset so that you're building a really well grounded assortment for the consumer. That's based on data, but it's also based on giving them product and product that they will love, and sometimes product that they need, certainly. But I think, I've been gifted a great career in retail, and I landed on something that just feeds both of those sides of my brain.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you have another characteristic which I think is important. So it's you're creative, you're analytic, but I mean, you were chief merchandising officer at a number of these places. I think
Mhm,
chief marketing officer at one of them. So you have
mhm,
to have
mhm.
the communication skills as as well.
Yeah.
At what point did you start developing that? Because you had the ideas, but
Mhm.
then how did you what point did you really develop the communication skills that push those ideas through?
Oh, that's such a great question. I think one of the greatest gifts, in my career was working for Target Corporation. And, really, they develop holistic leaders who are grounded in building a great strategy, first and foremost, understanding how to execute that strategy, thinking about how do you develop the team and help them grow through both of those two things. And then how do you show up? with energy, enthusiasm, optimism, but communication becomes a really, really big part of that. And so, ensuring that you know who your constituents are, you know who your audience is, and so that you're really anticipating what their point of view may be so that you're really harnessing, honing in. That's a new word.
Honusing.
Harnessing, I like that one actually. You're really able to then find those points of connection with that audience and understanding like how you build that communication strategy, not only with your internal cross-functional partners, but then as you noted, I had a marketing role as well. How are you thinking about taking that forward to the customer and what's important to them and identifying the key decision points that they're thinking through when they're purchasing a product?
Yeah. Yeah. I think merchandising in particular, especially at the C level, man, you're just working with so many different departments. You're working with data scientists. You're working with local store marketers. You're looking working with the managers. You're working with supply chain to get it there.
Yes.
It's just you gotta you're managing a lot of personalities. So from Target, GNC, Route 21, how
Mhm.
did those environments shape how you thought about localizing product mix?
Well, I think one of the gifts when I was at GNC is when my scope really expanded. And so, I had every single touch point until the point in time at which it landed in the store. So I had everything from inception of idea to developing the idea, sourcing the idea. I had the third party buying teams, planning allocation, visual, marketing, and then the distribution teams. And so having to think through all of those points when it landed in the store, and what are the things that we as a merchandising team holistically can be doing to bring that product to the customer and best connect with them to give it the best propensity to then sell, and be the retailer of choice, in that particular marketplace. And so, one of the big learnings in that role in particular is that you have to bring people along internally to be able to pull that through line together. Like, why should we be doing this? How are we providing
Mm.
the right information at store level so that we're really giving them the information and ammunition, if you will, to help best sell that product, and help with the consumer facing portion of that journey as well?
Were you at Macy's when they did the Macy's My Way? Because when I think about localization, that's for whatever reason that comes. There's like Best Buy and Macy's kind of come to mind. Were you there when that was happening?
I was there at the time that they had purchased Marshall Fields. They had been kicking off the My Macy's project. And that was I very clearly remember the meeting that I was sitting in when they talked about the ideas of the way that they were approaching localization. And at that time, it was very much, kind of based on the profile of the different types of customers that were in a marketplace and how you could go so wrong if you weren't understanding where's the population growing and what's the makeup of that population going to look like. So really getting in advance of thinking about what do we need to get ahead of, and everything down to the product as well as store signing, and do we have the right language in our stores? So I think that was the very initial, part of that journey. This is going back, probably 17 years ago. And I know they took and really ran with that over the course of the last many years. But it's certainly a nugget that resonated with me prior to that, being part of a regional department store that had 60 stores. There were so many examples of where we were already seeing those opportunities to be able to refine and define our assortments by different marketplaces. So, as part of Marshall Fields, we had the upper Midwest, we had Detroit, we had Chicago. And then we had some stores down in Texas. And so there were very different nuances, by marketplace where you'd see a store that did 1% of the total volume to Marshall Fields, but they might do 50% of the volume in a particular category because of some nuance going on in that particular market, i.e., a religious requirement to sell a certain color of pantyhose to church.
Yeah.
And, sometimes it was a cultural thing or quinceanera, or the market was just more of a dress up market. So prior to kind of the more global idea of what, or a larger initiative like My Macy's, we were already doing that kind of work because we could, because we were 60 stores and able to do it at a
Yeah.
level that allowed us to embed it into our assortment planning.
So okay, so let me get this. Let me make sure I understand this. Was it you at Marshall Fields? that you were at? Okay, and then you guys had the capability, you had 60 stores, which is actually manageable so that you can
Hmm.
actually service that religious community where pantyhose was like they're selling a lot of those things. Is that, I mean, we talked a little bit before this. Is that the same place where you came up on dresses in Texas?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and
What
we
was the
also saw,
situation there?
well, in the case, at that point in time now, our society is kind of flipped over to a much more casual society since that point in time. But, in Texas, they wore a lot more dresses. There was a less of a leisure type of customer in that marketplace. And so we had 4 stores there, and they did almost 50% of our dress volume because of the propensity to choose a dress versus something more casual in nature. Now, I'm going back a really long time ago, but
Yeah.
that's certainly something that we saw. One of the, I guess, tools that we had were a great assortment planners who could get into the data and identify these interesting phenomena as happening with the sales data by store, so that we really then were able to ensure that we were feeding that opportunity and that potential so that we could get each store to really create a much stronger performance profile.
Yeah, and then you jump to Macy's, and they're obviously much bigger, and they just don't have the
Yes.
capacity, or even it's not, maybe not even reasonable to do it at that level. And I think that maybe you would bring up a question that I know a lot of retailers listening to this are probably having. At what point do you need to be starting to think about store localization as a brand, as a retailer? Like, do you even need to be thinking about that at 5 stores because you're small enough anyways? Like, what does that maturity curve look like?
Yeah, I don't know that it's so specific to the number of stores that you have within your cluster. It's really about the resourcing and the way that you can get the data and be able to action on it, right? So if you're 5 stores, you have the people to be able to assort specifically to those stores and do it effectively. It really starts with what's the brand? What are we standing for? What are we trying to service? So an Everlane who serves up core basics for the most part may have a very common assortment, and that's what they're known for. And
Yep.
their localization efforts might be sizing and color, versus some of the different nuances that you would see in a much more fashion retailer who's starting to think about differences not only in sizing and color, but print and pattern, the type of fashion, the balance of fashion versus core in those stores. So I think there's a lot of different thoughts. And then to answer your question, to scale that, really takes great assortment planning systems that can embed that data, and having, whether it's assortment planners or planning kind of experts on your team to really be able to get at that and start building the analytics, or data scientists to kind of wrapping their hypotheses around what those clusters could be. So at
Yeah.
scale, volume obviously is the starting point. Climate becomes a really important next step when I think about my history at Target, right? That's like a no-brainer what we're selling in the North. You don't wanna be putting mufflers and mittens and a lot of heavyweight things in Florida in the wintertime. So you really start going through where can you have a real point of failure in your inventory investment, and where you would look really off from a customer perspective, and having something show up in a marketplace that means nothing to them or makes absolutely no sense in their marketplace whatsoever.
Yeah, so it kinda depends on what is your strategy and then what is your resources, and I think of, this is a
Yeah.
restaurant example, but Raising Cane's, their assortment is literally they have one menu item. It's just like everyone gets the same thing, and that is the beauty. That's the beauty of Raising Cane's. And then, yeah, I'm sure there's other retailers that probably just go to the nth degree, and that is how the customer feels heard, and you just have to resource that. And I think we're kinda
But
getting at. Go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, even in the example of Raising Cane's, I would think the sauces would have, different opportunities by marketplace based on the population that might be based there. So I think there's, localization applies to me in
Yeah.
almost any venue. Even
Yeah.
Raising Cane's, I can see that opportunity.
Well, so what are some of the benefits of localization? What KPIs are retailers trying to move with that?
Yeah, I think about, when we've had measurements in place as we've gone through different localization strategies, certainly you want to see sales lift occur as a measurement. You want GMROI, certainly, right? The whole point would be beyond the customer, and customer sentiment to me is the first and foremost, right? You want to ensure that you're really connecting with that consumer. But from the true financial performance metrics, certainly GMROI is a key because you want to get the right inventory that doesn't turn into a markdown. And GMROI is obviously the measurement for that.
Are you saying Jim Roy?
Gross margin return on investment.
Let me write that
Basic.
down.
And you can also say gross margin return on inventory too. I mean, you can look at that metric and just say, am I getting the most out of the inventory that I'm putting into a store and it is not turning into a markdown? And so it's as productive as it possibly could be. And that I think is, certainly the most important one. And then I think you also can look at once I understand those, am I keeping my in stocks? If you're constantly running out of stock in locations because they're selling out of it because they care about it more so than other stores, you need to be looking at your inventory from that perspective as well. So you can go down, to many different levels, but I think Jim Roy is a huge starting point. And sales lift. Are you getting the lift out of, again, where you're localizing? Is it at a class of product level? Is it a subclass? Is it at a true product level? And are you seeing a lift in that category or that sales item based on, your hypothesis and what should or could sell in those locations?
So gross margin return on inventory, are you looking at that across the entire store so that there's like one metric, or is it like by category you're looking at that?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the highest level you're looking at it, but when you're really trying to measure it at a localization standpoint, you're not necessarily going to localize your entire assortment, right? You might have 85% of your assortment going commonly to stores, and I'm using that very loosely. And then there's 15% that you might need to be customizing. And a great example of that, let's say I have a common assortment, I'll go back to my supplement career. So in Ann Arbor, Michigan, the other 15%, I might be thinking about what does a college student need? They need energy, they need hydration, they need grab and go food items, which might be very different than what I put in Naples, Florida, who may have a different need for adult nutrition, other types of products that are categorized for better functioning and support from a true performance standpoint. And I don't mean athletic performance, I mean brain functioning, categories like that. Ultimately, as you're thinking about then those categories you're leaning into, that's where sales lift becomes really important. Am I seeing that my hypothesis is proving itself out, that putting more energy drinks into that particular square footage in a college town is going to ultimately serve me much better than another choice that I could be making in that store?
The 85-15 to 85% is your standard
Mhm.
just in with stuff you stock, and the 15% is what you localize. That
Mhm.
makes it feel like it's less to bite off, It feels like, okay, only
Yeah.
15%, we're gonna actually edit, and that'll ideally make someone feel heard and seen in the store too.
Well, and I think you take that, a few more steps further, right? You think about that 15 can have a lot of impact, especially if you shift that to the front of the store. If it's what the customer sees in the windows when they're walking by, it could also mean knowing you're in a college community. Are you staffing your store that's reflective of the customer? Where is that location? Is it truly on campus or just in Ann Arbor, Michigan, but maybe nowhere near campus? So you have to really use your field to help support some of those hypotheses on getting the store merchandising correct, the visual merchandising, the staffing. So it's a 360-degree approach, and it's not just about the product choices. And I do think your store teams become really, really important in that. The data can tell you one thing, but then ultimately there could be some flaws in, what it's showing in a particular moment in time because there might be a staffing issue or something is in the back of the
Mm,
store where it shouldn't have been. So getting the
yes.
human side of that beyond the data becomes really important. And I know when I was going through this work in the supplement space, we had a number of examples of that where we had to take the data, review it, and we built a cross-functional team of all of our different partners and constituents to really vet the data and say, we would have thought this, we're not
Yeah.
seeing this, and why? And I remember in one great example, we had a cluster about tourism, and we weren't seeing one of the stores perform in the way that had historically. And it was in part just because where their tourists came from, there was a travel ban going on. And that was something that was going to loosen up in time. But for the moment in time that we were in, some of the large quantities of very specific products that they would buy in that store were no longer relevant until that customer came back into the country again.
I think what you're saying there is critical about talking to the store team because I just think about a
Yeah.
data scientist noticing, like, all right, sales of this particular this SKU is down. Well, it's because the SKU got moved to the back of the store, and then you could just bring an entire insight out on like, well, we don't need to be stocking the SKU in here. But if you talk to your store manager and it's like, no, that's just in the back of the store, and that's totally why it's happening. And it
Yeah.
almost it's like that's imperative that you're able to talk to them. How do you make sure that that loop constantly happens? Like you have set meetings with the store managers.
Yeah, and again, this is, very specific to the retailer and their ability to connect at a deeper level with the store teams. We made this a huge priority, and certainly in the supplement space, because education was so important and getting feedback was so incredibly important, and getting those feedback loops were really, really important. So they are a critical constituent in that process.
So let's, if we could kind of think about merchandising on and localization on a spectrum
Hmm.
where one side is like everybody gets the same stuff, like Raising Cane's, and the other side
Yep.
is this utopian world where everything changes like every day you walk in there. I mean, what are the different approaches that go from not very high localization to high localization? Like, what are the different groups there?
Yeah, I think that is probably the real question, right, that every retailer has to think about and unlock is what's gonna be the payback, and what are the resources that we have to be able to execute it, because it can become an extraordinarily complex thing to execute if you don't have the right data, the right systems. You cannot do this manually, or it just becomes like this rabbit hole that you could not
Mhm.
get out of. I think it really depends on kind of the nature of the business itself, and where there's probably that strongest emotional connection, like when you get it really, really right, and where the customer really, really cares. um, that's kind of the swing on the pendulum. There's certain categories that a basic's a basic, and I just that's all I need, and it's white sock. So I think the more you refine and get a more complex assortment is when you really have to think about that spectrum a little bit differently, and then how can you serve that? Because the trickiest part of the localization is trying to build that hierarchy on, like, where are we
Mhm.
gonna start with first? And in
Yes.
some cases, it might be, first, we're gonna think about our stores. What's our fleet of stores look like? And we may have mall stores, we may have outlet stores, we may have strip stores, and which behaviors are alike? Well, mall stores, people are out walking around, and they might go across your storefront. A strip center, that's more of a destination. I'm driving to that store to buy something. And then an outlet is usually a value shopper, or they're just out and about. It's an entertainment venue in some way, shape, or form. But typically, there's a value nature to the product that they're looking at. So you're starting at that kind of premise of what stores and volume obviously is the halo over all of that. And then you start getting into the store types. And then you think about climate and lifestyle,
Mhm.
fashion versus core. You just start going down, and that's, from a fashion perspective, and it'd be different for different categories. But you really have to like figure out that hierarchy on where are you going to start getting the biggest payback, and breaking that down. And then can your systems keep up? Can your teams keep up with the more complicated that you would make it? Because at a point in time, it could get so bifurcated that
Yeah.
until you have a system, likely with AI, we're going to see that come very quickly, where all of those assertions can be built into the systems, and you're doing more bottoms up buying versus more of a tops down buying. That's building in the quantities that you need to purchase upstream versus the other way around. And today there's a hybrid of that. Certainly that exists, but I think it will get much, much more refined in the future.
So I think what I'm hearing you say, and I think the real question I'm asking here is like, if you're a retailer, like where do you go on the spectrum? And you're saying it's not necessarily about choosing a point on the spectrum. It's like you got to start somewhere, and then it's an iterative process. And I think generally, like you're gonna start with your lowest hanging fruit if your fashion climate would be one of those, and then
Yes.
and you can add on to it. And it's not necessarily like one shot we're going to do this whole thing. It's like a step by step where you go deeper, and eventually you're going to have diminishing returns.
Well, I think even in the case of the CPG world, you can find that with the planograms and the space that stores have created, you'll see very common assortments across markets. And you're over investing in inventory in a lot of those stores because you're trying to build this very common experience that the customer is going to get, on one level. But on another level, you're putting all this inventory in there that could sit and age and never, really connect with the customer in any way or, certainly turn over into a sale. So I think it extends really across every category, but that retailer has to start at a decision tree on certainly getting it right by volume. In the case that I just gave to you, our inventory is sitting in a lot of the stores that it shouldn't be, and I gotta realign my inventory to the
Yeah.
right stores and ensure that I'm feeding, and I love this term that we used to use at Target called super freaky. Like these stores that you might have an A store, but these are like the A plus plus stores that performs way beyond, any crazy thing that you could imagine because of some interesting nuance going on in their marketplace.
I feel like there's something with Target being in Minneapolis and super
Mhm.
freaky. Minneapolis and super freaky just go together to me.
I don't know who coined it, but I've used that so many times because it's just one of those words you can't get out of your vernacular.
Yeah, you can't lose it.
No.
Okay, well, I want to talk about data sources, and maybe I want to stir the pot here with you. I mean, why not just use your own sales data? Like, why just use your own point of sales data, and that should guide you into what should sell there. Why would you need any other data sources?
Such a great question. So I think your sales data gets at what you are already serving up to the customer, right? But additional sales data gives you all the opportunities that you have missed or that you don't even know that are out there. Um, One example that I think about, most recently is we had in my last experience a huge screen T-shirt business, and in a very particular market, let's just call them out. Nashville's going to want, very strong penetration and probably more of a country western screen T-shirt side of the business than maybe LA or Seattle, might want from a screen T-shirt business. And you may not have been catering to one of
Mm,
those. You probably were, but you may not have been. But without getting into data, certainly like the the live data, like you would not have that ability to start really customizing and understanding we have a need here that we're not filling. And I think that's where the data, the external data and appended data to your consumer data really can start bringing in a lot more dimension around needs, customers that you may or may not be serving, but are in your market that you could be serving. And again, it gets back to who are we? What do we want to be? And is this on brand or not on brand for who we are? Um, but I think augmenting your own data gives you a lot of opportunity for sure.
what would you say that it just helps you create more hypothesis? Is that the role of third party data?
Yeah, it can, I think it dimensionalizes, what the decisions that you're already making. You may be in a category, but it's going to give you more dimension on where you could take that category. So back to that screen t-shirt business, I may be in this part of a wheelhouse on it, but it gives me this idea that I can start testing, to your point, some other hypotheses where I have a right to play
Yeah.
with the customer who's visiting our stores.
Well, can you tell our audience a little bit about what you're doing with the Persona Live data set, with that? Because that really tickles me. It's something I never expected to see.
The t-shirt side of the business.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
The screen printing T-shirts.
Yeah. Well, I think that was, the example that I was just sharing. We're really trying to get into like all the different drill downs that we could take with Performa, right? Or Persona, so sorry. And I think in that case, we got into like music interests and what resonated in a market. And then we clicked deeper, and we could see there's a propensity for more country western in this market, more rock in this market. And so the screen t-shirt business is a fascinating one because you can move on that really quickly. And so you can flow it in and it's produced really quickly. So you can have a pretty big impact on your business by testing that hypothesis really quickly. There's an art to that for sure.
Now, I mean, did you guys ever do the do the thing where it's like Taylor Swift is coming to town, so let's get those
No.
shirts stocked?
Yes, Taylor owns the rights to all of that. So we certainly had all the data and information on concerts and who's coming to town. And
Okay.
sometimes it was like look-alike or, what might we have some ability to have rights to. Some of the older rock bands, there was opportunity to carry their product. But think about even other cultural phenomena coming to town too. It could be Hamilton, it could be the release of a movie, and you're thinking about where is the big premiere going to be, and so this whole phenomena of dress up became very very big. In the last couple of years, people dressing up in Wicked and dressing up to go to Taylor Swift concerts. So understanding kind of the calendar certainly plays a really important role, and then taking that a step deeper and where is that going to be distorted in a marketplace in particular.
Yeah. Yeah. Those are really fun ones, and I'm shocked when people are able to act quick enough to be able to do that. Well, let's
Yeah.
do some fundamentals here. I was passing some emails back and forth to you, and I was trying to figure out, okay, what are the actual steps to identifying these store clusters? So maybe can you take us from the beginning of like what happens on step one, step two, step three of doing this localization process?
Yeah, I think at the, very start of it, it is an outcome of some sort of strategic discussion, right? Is this going to be an important game changer for us or a source of differentiation for us as a retailer? Starts with a strategic imperative. We believe that our connection with the customer and our performance can improve by better localizing our assortment. That might be the, summary's imperative statement. Then it is really refining and defining, okay, what does our data set really need to start looking like as we think about drilling into what are the possibilities here? And by nature of that, you might start with a smaller core group, data scientists, merch analytics, merchandising teams, maybe somebody from the stores, really starting to drill into that information. And once you have the information, then it comes into the true cross-functional team that you want to start sharing that out. We are going down a path of really trying to explore this opportunity in localization and segmentation. Here's what the data is telling us right now. Let's have an open discussion around what we're seeing. But we see a group of stores that are reading high on X, Y, and Z in this particular, and we have 50 stores that are reading like this. And let's talk about why. And
Hmm.
so you start looking at all the variances in the data. That's certainly something in the supplement space that we were doing. We also were doing it in the fashion space where we could just see interesting, and they're very clear. It's not like it's very green light. You can see it pretty quickly. Um, in some cases, though, the stores will come in and say, well, I'm really surprised that this store is not reading this way. And this gets back to what we were talking about earlier. There may be a moment in time reason for that, or there could be a replenishment issue where product hadn't been being fulfilled or had never been on a planogram in the first place. And so it helped kind of find a hole that needed to be solved
Mm.
for. So you work to kind of refine. And so that initial list maybe was at 80%, and you get some great feedback and you get it to 100% of your test group. And so you look at then within that, what are the stores we're going to test? And then who is our control group of stores? And you really
Hmm.
start then building what does the testing plan look like? We've identified the stores, then what is a 360-degree approach that we really need to think about to set this up for success? And so we were chatting a bit earlier about kind of that 85-15. What is the merchandising and the in-store visual plan? Certainly the buyers have to step way back and go, can I even get the product, in the first place to make these shifts and changes because it has to be
Yeah.
available from the vendors, right? So that's one of the first things. Then you're having to think about, do I have to recreate planograms if I'm a type of retailer who has planograms? So you have to relay planograms. You might have to relay a store. If you're going to do a test, you want to do it really to your best view of what end state success would look like. So you really get a great read. And you're thinking about then what is that execution plan, any sort of education, where you bring the stores along, in some cases, staffing changes or
Mm,
thoughts that you might want to have to really, again, bring that all full circle. That might be like a part two version of it. But I think we've got to make this clear enough to the customer that they're going to get the joke. Like we've made a complete change. We understand you, we understand maybe where some of our points of failure were with you in the past, and we are going to shift and hopefully be that retailer of choice because I walk by and I see it right in the store in my line of sight as I'm walking past the store. So then you determine when is that point in time that you could get that completely executed. And then you get to that execution state, you test, you learn, you iterate, what performed well, what didn't perform. It could be at a store level, it could be at a category level, and you keep testing and iterating. And what I like to say about localization, again, it's a gift that keeps on giving. You're keeping refining and building, and you think about your marketing as well. What's the messaging that you're going to share with the consumer, both the in-store visuals and then potentially the marketing messaging externally too. Like, what is my media plan? How do I need to change this and resonate differently? What types of media do I need to serve up in that market? And you also have to start thinking about formats of stores as well. Like if something's really interesting and resonating, do we need more of these? One of the things that I thought was super interesting, um, and I'll use the supplement space again for this one, but you might have a larger footprint, in a mall environment or a strip, but you might have a really small footprint in an airport or in a subway, location or train station. And so you had to think really differently about how do we make the store really productive and give the customer what they want, and you're churning and turning, and you have to think then to your earlier point about supply chain, how are we feeding the demand that now that we're seeing flow through that because they're selling the packs, they're selling energy drinks, they're selling grab and go bars, and we have to keep up with that demand by starting to get this really right. But if we get that model right, we get the performer right for that particular store, that opens up an opportunity to open up many more of those types
yes.
of destinations. So it's even getting to the actual format of the store in that example. Of all of a sudden, there's an outcome of something that becomes a much bigger business opportunity based on what that localization test is telling you.
Yeah. Yeah, that feels like there's a lot of unlocks along the way. Like even the process of gathering the data is where you're finding holes that you didn't know that you weren't plugging in. So like that, the process to get you there, the journey to get you there, probably has ROI within it without even finishing out a store
Oh, yeah,
clustering exercise in total.
absolutely. Because there are tweaks that you can make in the short term, dependent upon the category, lead times, many things, but you get insights in every single data pull. It's so fascinating. And so some you can action on without having the complete plan built out because you just know that there's a performance improvement opportunity there.
So one part that I'm wondering about is, so I get you. You have this strategic discussion. You look at the KPIs you want to move, and then you have your data requirements. So you're getting
Mhm.
all your data together. Then how do you choose how you cluster those stores? Like, do you say, well, we want to do it in groups of 5, or we want to do it in groups of 10, or like, how do you get the actual number? Because like, you're not saying, I've got 200 stores. I'm going to treat them all differently. How do you think about that?
You're looking at, to me, what I'd call lookalike stores where you're seeing similarities. And this gets into kind of truly what can we execute or not execute, right? You're looking at a cluster of stores that are reading very similarly. And if we go back to like the college example, you're going to see there's a whole bunch of stores where we're seeing hydration, performance drinks, or energy drinks, bars selling, and they're kind of off the charts versus another group of stores. You start with a hypothesis like, okay, let's take all of our college towns and see if, we see this. So it's kind
Yes.
of this back and forth, right? We did the
Yeah.
same thing with retirement communities. We said, let's think about Naples and let's think about Palm Springs and areas where there may be just a different need for the types of products that they would have at that store. We've probably found in that case a little lesser then, but there was other nuances like the college towns were certainly, very clear on what the students A had budget for and B, how often they were coming into the store to buy the products as well. And
I
so
think
the
go ahead.
it's a back and forth, right? You start with a hypothesis, you look at the data, that's where the color from the store team can also come into play. Again, the case of a college town poll that we did, they all said they were in a college town. Well, the ones right at campus, great. They might have been in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I'm using that as an example, right? But they were 10 miles away, from
Yeah.
college. So that did not matter at all. They just happened to be in that community. So you have to really this is what happens when you're centralized. You can think you're on a path of something that's an unlock, but in an example like that, proximity becomes really important in a case like a college community.
Yeah, I think the light bulb going off for me right now is you're allowing the data to change your frame of reference. The data is telling you the clusters pretty much. You're not saying,
Yeah.
I want 5 clusters, or I want north, south, east, and west, or I want this by climate. You are looking at the data, exploring it, and then like something surfaced for you. All right, hydration is really good at all of these. What's true about all of these? Well, they're all college
Hmm.
ones. And so it's perfectly reasonable for you to have a cluster of 50 and a cluster of 10, right? Because it's just,
Yeah. But then this gets back to, right, what can we actually execute or not? And
yes.
executing 50 sometimes is the power of what we can purchase as well. If you have a real one off in those 5 stores and you have to completely rethink and buy things that aren't in your standard assortment, that's pretty hard to execute. But if it's simply a tweak of how much space you're giving a category versus other stores, the penetration of that category to that total store, that is that's not in theory, a difficult thing to execute, but it does require space planning, different ways of buying, assortment planning tools. Like there's a lot to execute behind the scenes to get there. And some of it,
Yeah.
certainly in test phase, is very manual. So you have to really be committed to doing some manual intervention until you can get the systems really aligned to be able to do the work.
Yeah. I mean, I just so appreciate your perspective on this because on the other end, you know that you actually got to execute it. And
Hmm.
I guess I was kind of coming into this. So my frame of reference is this. We honestly do a clustering approach, but we do it with people. And
Hmm.
the way that we do it actually is purely mathematical. We're doing k-means segmentation on the behavior of people,
Hmm.
and we have the capacity to do that because we're not on the hook for stocking stores. You know what I mean? But the
Right,
other
right.
benefit that you get, so we get this k-means segmentation of people, and then we have to figure out, why did the machine cluster this group of people? And then, we'll
Hmm.
go in there as a research and describe it. But you actually have that built into the process because you were part of the rules-based system for why it got clustered in the first place. So your capability for describing it internally is just going to be that much stronger.
Yeah, and I think the descriptions are really important, so everybody's understanding what you mean. Even words like, what does segmentation mean? What does clustering mean? Down to then, what is a tourist store versus a college store? Like, what are all the vernacular that you're using within this process so everybody in the organization understands clearly what
Yeah.
you're defining as that segmentation strategy? Because even in marketing, that's a little bit different, right? That
Yeah.
terminology. I do think, it gets back to at the highest level, merchant's going to look to what can I execute the biggest size of price, and then testing that theory and how's the data clustering it. And you're bouncing those two things against one another to prove out the point and then determine is this executable or not.
Yeah. What are the points of friction in the process, both technical and in social friction? Where does that come up?
I think the data is certainly one of the friction points because you have to really get into it and say, why is this look the way it looks? And really understand, is it fact based? Is it really, true? Um, and it sometimes could be that the whole opportunity is not rising to the top because you haven't even given them the full assortment and they've kind of capped the potential. Um, so there's just a friction in data's great, but it needs some intervention to really read it and
Mm,
understand it and what is it telling me, right? So this is the conversation going on much more broader in the world today. But you have to have some of that human intervention to understand what are we not seeing here, to truly get at it. And then I do think the other part is back to where we were talking about communication, right? Is helping everybody understand the whys, and the communication effort becomes really, really important. And then really listening to the other constituents on what are we not thinking of, you know, the visuals, the language, these are a cluster of stores that we actually need to have Hispanic language, first and
mm.
foremost, because the market reads this way, and that should be our first point of messaging. Um, so, there's a lot of just different nuances that y- listening becomes a really important part of this as well. And that's part of the communication effort that goes along,
I
with
just
it,
love this
certainly.
quote of your data needs an intervention. Just it kind of cracks me up. So you
Probably
had
not
this
what you
interesting
want to hear.
perspective. Well, you had this perspective. Were you both chief merchandising officer and CMO at GNC? Is that where you held both titles? Okay. That's an interesting perspective to have, to understand the connection between merchandising and marketing. Can you tell me how that played out? Is like, how did these two things connect with each other?
Oh my gosh. To me, that is the dream state in retail because you understand the strategy behind the why. Why are we giving this product to the customer? What's our point behind it? And having a marketing team so attached at the hip and aligned with that effort so that there's a lockstep effort in terms of the messaging and communication. And if you think about a GNC, the product's so technical.
Mm,
So that team also has to become really
mm,
embedded and become semi-experts in the vernacular and like what is going to resonate with the customer as well. But I think bringing products to life, a buyer in nature as a marketer, at the same point, they buy something and they can see the potential and they can see how it comes to life. And so when the marketing organization is so intimately attached to merchandising and the teams are, having that interaction together, to me, it's the best possible scenario in retail because that execution effort, you're aligned on a common goal and mission around the product and that potential to sell. And you're all together in the strategy up front and upstream. So the idea of the campaign and the marketing efforts all go hand in hand.
yeah, that definitely makes sense to GNC, because I mean, I'm sure the material that you handed to your employees was different
Mhm.
by store region. Like right next to a college, there's going to be a different ask than near a retirement community. And it's almost like you have to be like a semi-diagnosis. If someone goes in there, it's like, oh, I know I can't sleep. You know what? And then that person needs to be prepared. How did it play out regionally? Like, would you run different regional campaigns for those clusters, or were those who's not connected?
Yeah, we weren't there yet. Certainly see that opportunity. We weren't there yet. We were doing some interesting testing when I was at Rue. And this was probably more based on traffic patterns that we were seeing, but we were using a company like Placer who
Hmm.
helped us on all fronts, real estate, marketing, and merchandising, to help us is certainly taking persona live in and ingesting that into merchandising decisions could have parlayed right into the way that we were able to then communicate to customers, think about our media, where we were placing our media dollars, et cetera. And sometimes then even informing into the real estate decisions that we were thinking about as well. But ultimately, we were running some really interesting tests at Rue, and they were off the charts in terms of the return that we were getting on them. But it didn't necessarily get yet into localizing the kind of campaigns that we were doing.
Yeah. Well, I'm wondering if you have any pointers on this because it's a it's a torch I'm starting to want to take up, and that's this. So location and people matter in so many places when we're talking about retail brands. They matter with where you site select your next store.
Yes. Yep.
They matter with merchandising because you already argued that you need this demographics and stuff, and then and it matters in marketing. But these three functions often don't talk to each other. They often don't share budget. Like, how do you create the communication between these three, and why do they tend to be siloed off in companies?
Yeah, I think silos, are often created just by size and scale, unfortunately. Although I've seen them even in some of the smallest organization, and that's just cultural. And so one of the things that I've worked at in the last probably 3 or 4 different roles I've had is breaking down the silos because the magic in retail happens when you're all understanding one another and you're connecting together. You can't over collaborate, but you have to communicate.
Hmm.
And that becomes really, really important so that you're aligned, with the objectives that you're really trying to hit upon. So I think, it's certainly critical and certainly important when you think about getting down to that localization that you're talking about, even at like a regional level. At Rue, we were changing out our mannequins and having different mannequin sets based on things that we were seeing in our localization efforts and some of the hypotheses that we were going after and it would mean a mannequin would sell out, and we had to have a backup because it was that kind of reaction that we were getting. I mean, this is the really fun and magic, and then you're on point because the customer is starting to really notice the things that you're putting front and forward to them, and you take that then to a marketing effort similar if that's just visual marketing, right? Then you have media that you're giving them similar storylines and it's like, "Oh, I love that. That speaks to me." So I think we're scratching the surface on, really being able to get at how you can start defining and some retailers are really doing that well already. But it's certainly an opportunity to drill in for most retailers at this point.
And then good on you for the efficiency of spend there because you're buying a software and then you're able to use that across departments, and that's awesome. And it also becomes sort of this lingua franca that these departments can speak to one another in similar terms if they're using similar software.
I think the interesting thing is this is not a hard sell typically. I think everybody knows and sees the opportunity. It's just building the strategy behind it to be able to execute it. I have yet to find a group who doesn't want to, you know, participate in some way, shape, or form. It's about bandwidth, resourcing, et cetera. And so once you kind of can crack that code, you've got a lot of buy-in. It's not been truly an issue.
Hmm. Let's talk a little bit about where retailers can go wrong with this. What are some well-intentioned merchandising moves that you've seen that just went off the rails?
Well, I think certainly back to what we were just talking about, like overcomplicating. You can't execute something when you certainly make it too overcomplicated. So it gets back to always kind of to me that 85-15. Like, how do you just break it down into the simplest part of let's start here and we can keep going deeper as we need to. And I think the other place that you can really go wrong is this communication piece. Are we all talking the same language? Because there's been instances where people will use the word segmentation and clustering hand in hand. They'll flip them and reverse them. And I think you really have to just say, for us, this is what this means across this organization. This is how we're using the word segmentation. and having it defined and on the intranet or wherever you need, like wherever your communication stream needs to be, just so that people are not confusing then the work to be done because they could go down a really wrong path of their own work if they're thinking they're supposed to be executing one thing versus what they're truly supposed to be executing. So, those are areas that to me, overcomplication and just lack of communication can be some real misfires.
When it comes to communication, I'm wondering, did you name your clusters?
We did, yeah. Yeah, we named them. And even within the naming of the clusters, they needed to make sure that there was a real descriptor to what that mean. We needed to make them as about as overt as they possibly could without somebody being able to, understand it at a deeper level, like tourist. What does tourist mean? Um, the one that probably gets the most confused is the word urban. And urban can be population density. Urban, years ago meant a different type of customer profile. So understanding and defining what does this word mean to us so that we all are executing down the same path on a word. The tour is pretty clear cut.
How does that actually impact the work that gets done, the descriptors that you use? Because, I mean, you got a descriptor and you
Mm,
can call it a tourist store, but aren't you just saying, like, we need to stock these exact things and you shouldn't really care if it's tourist or not? Like, how does the descriptor actually impact the people that read it?
I think if I'm a merchant, certainly that's where I would go. Am I actually part of this? Is this something that I should be thinking about? Should I be bringing some product to the party that could actually play into this tourist? It's part of the thinking through what more could we be or become. I think at a store level, they probably know it and feel it most days because they see who their customer is coming in and out, and they'll be probably grateful that the
Mm.
merchandising team is actually supplying them with product that is really serving the customer that they need to in that marketplace. But if I think back at the decision point, really understanding when we say tourist, we mean grab and go, we mean smaller pack size, something that, and I think the Target Local is a good example of this too. You can only carry so many, pack sizes of paper towels on a subway versus a two pack. And so, what do I have to be thinking about that's indigenous to that particular customer walking into that store? And that one always resonated with me. It's like, what can I truly carry on the subway or not?
Mhm.
And so, as I'm thinking as a merchant, satisfying demand into that location, am I really getting at the tourist customer, or in this case, the more suburban, or sorry, the more urban, I was going to say subway, but back to that example of kind of that kind of localized target assortment, mini target, if you will, it's really about who is the candidate that or customer that they're really serving in that marketplace.
How did it work out when you came up with this assortment strategy and then you have brands that are trying to sell into stores and get stocked? Like, was there ever tension there where it's like, yeah, we can't stock as much of your brand as we have been? How did that play
Mm.
out?
Um, yeah. It's always an interesting conversation, right? And I think it's an education process, certainly with our vendor community as well. Because at the end of the day, they don't want their product sitting on shelf and not selling.
Okay.
So, it gets back to how are we doing right as a partnership together? And maybe in another case, there's untapped opportunity in another store. We'll go back to that word super freaky, where we could really distort your product in this location and pull it out of the other location. So we're
Yes.
really refining and making your product seek its full potential. So it just becomes part of a really robust conversation around how do we be as successful as we can, certainly for the consumer and then in our business practice together.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes me think of something paradoxical that I've read about merchandising where and in one way you could think of it as making things more complex and it is like we're getting different products in different places, but there's also this example of you're simplifying some things because you're not stocking things that you don't need. And so
Right.
you could theoretically actually have less stuff going to a potential area. And your subway example is a perfect one of that because there is a number of products that you would sell to a suburban family that could put it in the car, but you just straight up can't sell to someone that's on a subway. And then you're just going to have a smaller assortment.
Think about a huge tub of protein powder, right? Who's going to carry that on a subway? Maybe a small pack or something else, but there's many, many examples, and you see it when you go into like I would challenge anyone listening to this go into some of those stores in very specific locations where people are on the go and they're just picking up something they need on the way home. And yet you see this very dusty, huge thing, whether it's a pack of paper towels or it's a tub of protein powder or you name it. They're probably sitting there and have dust gathering on them because it's just
Hmm.
not getting into the mindset of what that customer needs in that particular moment.
Yeah, which could be a real pain if it's a perishable product. Let's kind of take our view to the future here of merchandising. What do you think the biggest future unlocks are in merchandising? Because we're kind of on a precipice of a technological revolution with AI right now. How do you see all
Mhm.
that playing out?
Oh, I think there's so many avenues that could go, certainly, from supply chain efficiencies and just decision making overall. I think the data, the way that we can synthesize data more quickly, the way we can communicate with the customer in a different way. I mean, I think it's a super exciting time for retail because the speed at which we can operate on certain things can move very quickly. The time that it takes to manufacture product, we're getting shorter, slightly better. It's about having the data and then being able to action on that as quickly as you can or having the insights. And I think AI is going to be a really, really interesting unlock. I think there's areas that are a bit behind in it and areas that are ahead, and there's some incredible capabilities. And some retailers just have not had the opportunity to adopt to that yet. But it's really, to me, going to be just a massive unlock for retail. I think everybody's just a little bit at the point of building their AI strategy, trying to
Hmm.
figure out, how are we going to leverage this, and then in what particular business areas can we leverage it effectively?
Yep. Yep. Yeah, I think speed is the big one. Um, Anywhere where we can reduce friction and speed things up, like speed up a marketing campaign to a regional
Yeah,
area, because we just talked about that. Like that's really hard to do. Just as like it's pretty labor intensive to actually do that and execute on it.
but building content will be like super quick. Like, I think
I
that will
know.
be the really, like, amazing part of it, and people are already doing that. Um, there's obviously things that are more real time, and then lead times are still there from a product perspective.
Yep. Yep. Um, if you were mentoring a new VP of merchandising, what three principles would you pass on to them?
Would probably add a fourth one in there. I take this away from a long tenure in my career, but really starting with you have to be outstanding at building strategy, having a results plan to execute against that strategy, being a great developer of talent and team, kind of building that legacy behind you. But then ultimately, it's really about how your personal brand, how you think about yourself each and every day, and how you show up because the team's really looking at you as a leader. And are you showing up with energy, optimism, enthusiasm when you kind of come into the office or come online, whatever working environment you're in today? But it's really important that I've carried this with me for a long time in my career, and I always take it back to those 4 things, because the strategy is born of all the things that are, all the macro influences that are happening to the consumer. That's a really, really big starting point, and you have to think big and be bold, to really break through, but at the heart of all of it, if you don't care about the customer,
Mhm.
why are you here? And because the customer gets to vote each and every day on where they're going to show up and purchase product. And that is the singular reason that retail exists is to serve the customer. And so always having that right here in the forefront every single day is the customer, um, is just the most fascinating part of this whole retail story. And I hate to use this word because it's so overused, but I really am obsessed with the customer and their behavior. And if you're not as a leader thinking that way, that's a flag. And so you really need to shift that and make sure you're thinking about the customer, and getting that loop of feedback from them each and every day because it will really help inform your strategy in addition to all of those macro, the economy, what's happening globally, what's happening in the industry. There's all these other influences that inform your strategy, but the customer has to be at the heart and soul of it.
Let's go. Let's go. Yeah, you're singing to the choir on that one. Karlyn, this has been awesome. Um, Man, now that I've talked to you about merchandising, and I told you I was kind of a newbie at this, like this is something I really wanted to level up on. It is the spirit of doing it is very, very different than what I would have thought. But it is
Mhm.
also very practical. And now that I'm hearing you talk through it, like whoever is leading this, they really they have to be analytical. They have to care about the customer. They have to have
Mhm.
empathy. They have to be able to um communicate and get these things through, and then they have to the practical stuff of like how do we actually get the product into the stores. And
And
so
pick
like
the
my
product, right?
yeah,
It starts
yeah,
with understanding the category of products so intimately and being the very best at it in your field. Like that's always the aspiration is to be the most passionate person in that category in the retail community because that's where you really figure it out and make great things happen.
let's go.
I
Karlyn,
feel
thank you.
super blessed. I'm very fortunate to have found this career. Thanks, Lyden.
Thanks.